Next, I'd like to welcome onto the stage, or behind my black line, where I'm not allowed to move, is Dr. Emily Winters from Lancaster University. She's a lecturer in computer science. She's going to tell us a bit about her research at Lancaster Uni. So again, big round of applause for Emily. She comes forward.
Yeah, as Kerry said, I'm a lecturer at Lancaster University's School of Computing and Communications. I had a bit of an unusual role into computing, so I did a PhD in sociology. I've got no technical background. I ended up getting a job in computing, loving it, and I've been there for 5 years and worked in lots of different roles in the department. So my specialism is the kind of human and socio-technical aspects of software engineering. And what I want to talk to you today is about the role of human values in software development. So this was something I spent quite a bit of time researching a couple of years ago, and I hope it will be in some ways interesting for you today. So why do I think values are important in software development? So the products and services that are, I don't know if the microphone is working, is it okay? Yes, okay, it's good. So the products and services that are designed by software companies are obviously used by humans. They address human problems and needs, and they have profound societal consequences. So if we think about the last few years, we've seen really high-profile cases where there have been values breaches. So we might think about things like Cambridge Analytica, where things like privacy have not been taken sufficiently seriously. And that has led to major crises of public trust. So what I would argue is that it is really essential that software development companies consider values explicitly in their work, and that this is a first step to ensuring responsible software, and also for digital companies to build trust and build sort of reputations for being reliable and trustworthy. So what are human values? We can understand them in lots and lots of different ways. Many academics from lots of different fields have approached this problem. But one of the areas that I think is particularly helpful is the work of social psychologists. I'll try not to make this too dry. But basically, one of the key proponents here is a man named Shalom Schwartz, who's a social psychologist, and he's been researching values for about 30 years. And he defines values as the guiding principles of what people consider important in life. So values are the criteria by which we kind of select and justify our actions, how we evaluate people, ourselves and others, and also how we evaluate situations. What's really important about his contribution is that he doesn't just identify, here are some values. He argues that values exist in a model. So this is the fact that they exist in a kind of particular pattern of relations, which is what you can see here. And this has been observed through loads of research over multiple decades to exist in kind of fairly stable ways across different cultures. So the central thing in this model is that values operate along two oppositional axes. So we have conservation here with openness on the other hand, and again self-transcendence versus self-enhancement. So what the model suggests is that if a person values tradition, they're also likely to value conformity, which is next to it, and also security. And they're less likely to value the things in the opposite axis, so self-direction, stimulation. So putting this into software development speak, what this would suggest is that a software developer who perhaps really values kind of following industry rules, norms and conventions is probably going to be less likely to place loads of value on taking risks and like making lots of their own decisions. So that's kind of what the model suggests. The other thing that I thought was really interesting when it came to studying values was the work of another social psychologist called Greg Mayo. And he argues that values operate at 3 different levels. So this is the system level, so that's the one on the top in that diagram on the right top. So that corresponds to the patterns that I've just been talking about. And then there is the second level, which is the personal or abstract level. And that is how people interpret values. And what this means is that so people might have an idea about a value, but they might interpret this differently. So for example, for software developers, we can imagine software developers having very different interpretations of what it means to produce high quality software, which links to the achievement value. So for example, for one software developer, high quality software might be code that does the job it's required to do. For someone else, it might be elegant code, so different interpretations of the same thing. And then on the third level is the instantiation or behavioural level. So this is the actions that get taken as a result of holding particular values. So say, for example, you're an employee at a search engine that really highly values privacy. So DuckDuckGo is an example of that. This company will decide that one thing they're going to do is that they're never going to log user queries. So that's the kind of ways in which values can become enacted in quite kind of concrete software development terms. So I'm going to talk about my findings from a kind of medium-sized digital company based in the Northwest. So I was kind of based at this company for a month doing research. I'm not going to go into my methods loads, but I'm obviously really happy to take follow-up questions on this. But basically, we used a tool that we designed to research values. So this was me and my colleague, Marie Ferrario, who's now at Queen's University in Belfast. So we designed something that we called the Values Q-Sort. And essentially it's a card ranking or card sorting exercise where participants have to place cards on a grid according to their level of agreement with them. So each of these statements is related to one of the values that Schwartz identified in the model on the previous slide. And we also used language from the Association for Computing Machinery's Code of Ethics as well. So we kind of wanted language that kind of came from the computing field that we thought would be kind of more relevant to software developers. So what did I find and what are the implications? So one of the statements I was really interested in is this statement number 5 here. It is important to me that the public good is the central concern of all professional computing work. It's quite a strong statement, and that actually comes from the introduction to the Association for Computing Machinery's Code of Ethics. So I was really interested to see kind of how developers responded to this statement. What I found, firstly, was that developers often said, yes, this is absolutely important to me, but then they struggled to define it. They struggled to interpret it. What does public good mean? It's quite a big concept. How do we define this? I then also found that there were also instances where possibly developers shared definitions, but then they had really different actions as a result of that. So I had 2 participants in particular who said, well, I think the public good is about ensuring the right user experience. But then they had really different actions in response to that. So one of my participants, let's call her Laura, for her, promoting the public good was about promoting the right user experience, which was about optimizing the user experience based on using data trails to structure and personalize people's user journeys. Stuart, another engineer, interpreted it completely differently. For him, it was also about providing the right user experience, but he argued that this shouldn't be too structured or directed. And his argument was that if people don't express themselves the way they want, including online in their user journeys, then that's not in the public good. So 2 people here that had a similar sense of this being important, a similar sense of how they defined it, but very different actions. So what is the takeaway here? I think the key takeaway is that whilst developers may agree on abstract values, they are likely to differ a lot in how they interpret them and in how they act and behave as a result. I suggest that this may be a real cause of tension. One of the main things that I found was that values were often very implicit. They're hard for people to articulate, they're hard for people to define. And so I would suggest that not explicitly articulating values can lead to lots of tensions that may come from kind of implicit misunderstandings. I would also suggest that from my research, it's probably not enough to have a really abstract ethical code, because we found that people might agree on abstracts, but then really disagree on how those things get enacted. We definitely found that the Q-Sort was really helpful to kind of facilitate discussion around values and to encourage people to reflect on values, to build their values awareness, including kind of their own values. And we consider it also to potentially be a kind of first step where people can, there's definite trade-offs between values. We can see this here. You're never going to be able to satisfy all values, or you're going to struggle. There's always going to be trade-offs between values. So this is a good way to recognise those trade-offs, but also to potentially understands disagreements between colleagues as to how these things are interpreted and enacted. So it could be a good step towards kind of building consensus. Something else I would suggest is that we need to think about values in ways that they can be made more concrete for what they look like in software development processes. So some of you may know about the kind of, international standards organisations kind of way that they go about standards, which is they identify subject action and constraints. So to take a value that's really important and related to today's theme, diversity, we could have, for example, a kind of value standards related to diversity. So that might sound something like, the system we are developing will not discriminate, interpreted as collecting data in an inclusive way, enacted by gender never being a Boolean field. That would be one example. Another might be, the system we are building will not discriminate, interpreted as the system being accessible to all, enacted as following accessibility guidelines. So I think that's all I really want to say. I hope this is helpful or at least thought-provoking in some way. And real pleasure to present to you all and be here today. Thank you.
Right, have we got any questions for Emily? All right, we'll start in the room with you and then we'll go to Dan.
Did you notice a difference that was a gender difference? Because a lot of development is developed by men and used by women, and the way that developers they think about, especially things like UX, very differently because of their own gender bias.
So just to repeat the question for the people online, that is about, is there any difference in, I guess, the reaction to this card sort, depending on gender, based on that software developers a lot can be men, and therefore developer may have a certain mindset to developing software?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, which I unfortunately don't think I'm going to have a very satisfactory answer to. So gender wasn't one of the things that we were looking at specifically, so we didn't analyse the results of this according to gender. The results of these Q-sorts, when multiple people have done it, we're able to sort of perform some statistics where we can identify people that have essentially like prevalent patterns in the way that they filled it out, so kind of types of kind of common patterns in which people have filled it out. I certainly didn't notice that there was anything gendered going on in the patterns of like values types that we were finding. So I didn't find anything there. Looking back to the kind of qualitative data we were getting, I definitely think that we had, there definitely were things that were gendered. I think potentially like women working in software were more, like certain of these were slightly more, had slightly more weight in some ways. So for example, statement number 9, it is important to me that my work is respected. If you're in a minority in your workplace, that becomes more important than if that's something you don't have to worry about. But it also wasn't something we'd like looked at specifically in our analysis either. But it's a great question. And now I want to go back to all the data and look at it.
Brilliant. Dan, can I bring you in?
First question is, do you think that companies are taking values into account during the recruitment process?
Ooh, great question. It's really interesting. I think I don't know enough about recruitment to really answer that. But something I would also say is that we were also quite conscious that this kind of thing could have the potential to be misused. Like we certainly weren't wanting to like design an instrument that then categorise people as having like bad values or good values or anything like that. And we did have a couple of developers who, when we asked them to fill this out, were a little bit reluctant because they felt like they were being psychometrically assessed. And so I also would kind of caution against things like this being used in that kind of fashion, I think. But I also think it's like, if certain values are really important to you as a company, then obviously you want to be employing people that are going to kind of fit with that values and with that culture. So yes.
There's another follow-up question as well.
Yeah.
Actually, I've got a question myself that kind of makes sense with this. Someone that has also asked, do you believe that the values might differ for developers depending on whether they're actually employed in an organisation or whether they're freelance for an organisation?
Oh, that's a great question.
Or open source developers. And I was just going to ask on that as well. I noticed point number 12. Software I developed is commercially successful, and I wondered to what extent that might differ from sort of different levels of hierarchy.
Yeah.
So somebody who is director of a company versus someone who is developing. What is there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So actually, in the company that I was doing this research, there was quite a distinction between kind of paid employees of the company and contractors. And interestingly, I didn't really get to speak to many contractors because they didn't really want to speak to me. And I'm not fully sure why that is. I did speak to some contractors, but I think there was, with the ones I did speak to, there was a definite sense that they weren't quite so kind of invested in the company as a whole's values, whereas I think when I filled this out with people that were employees, they were reflecting on their personal values, but they were also reflecting on the values of the company a lot, and that didn't occur with the contractors, but they were also less willing to take part in the study. In terms of the commercially successful one, yes, definitely. People in more managerial positions, so for example, a product manager, will be more likely to rank that as important because it's probably a bit more on their head that is important. So there are all kinds of dynamics going on around the role, the team, the organisation and that kind of thing. So, yeah.
It's a complicated issue, isn't it, in
Very.
terms of values and how
Yeah.
different things influence it, and it'd be interesting to see what values change as in different organisations and different walks of
Yeah.
life of the same person. But
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah. It's kind of quite, it's a bit of a thing of debate, like within social psychology, as to like whether individuals' values are stable over time or they change. And that seems to be quite debated, but I like to think they can change.
I'm with you on that. I'd say that you could change a value if you learnt new information or,
Exactly,
or
yeah.
what have you. Definitely. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much,
no problem at
Emily,
all.
and a big round of applause for Emily.
Thank